Greetings. This is a lecture on communication channels for the course MBA 522 Decision Making in Organizations. We're going to be addressing just some basic issues around communication channels and specifically how decision making has an impact on communication channels, as well as how communication channels can affect the types of decisions that we make. So it's obviously a reciprocal relationship, and we'll get into these in a little bit more detail. Communication includes both verbal and nonverbal cues. Most of communication is actually nonverbal, but what we're going to talk about right now is just the basic process. There are a number of actors and a number of steps in this process, and it starts with a sender. A sender wants to communicate a message, whether it's verbal or nonverbal. They encode the message in a particular way, whether it's through nonverbal communication or with words or tone. They send the message. That message then gets decoded by the receiver on the other end of it. In the midst of this process, though, there's lots of distractors. There's lots of things that create noise. That interferes with the encoding and oftentimes can interfere with the decoding, so that we assume that the message that we sent and the way that we encoded it is understood by the person on the other end, but in fact there were a lot of other factors that interfered with that decoding. So here's the challenge. What are some of those things that are the noise? It could be tone. It could be emotions, it could be distractions from the environment, it could be your body language not in alignment with the words that you were using and the tone that you were using. You know, communication has three parts to it, so oftentimes when there is a mismatch between what we want to communicate and how we're communicating it, this can create noise and challenges for the person decoding. The type of medium that we use, whether we use face-to-face communication versus a text message, this also has an impact and provides noise in the decision, the communication process, so that when we hear information, we may not hear it in the way that it was intended. And of course, then there's a feedback loop, right? Once the receiver gets information, they provide feedback to the sender in good, proper communication, and to say, what I heard you say was X. That gives the sender the opportunity to correct them or to affirm that what they said was appropriate and was interpreted appropriately. So this is one giant feedback loop from the sender providing information, encoding it in a particular way, and then the receiver decoding it. Now the challenges, of course, are because every one of us has a different lens that we use to communicate with and to interpret the world. So as we think about the perceptual process in the next slide, we'll understand why there is so much noise and there is so much challenge in decoding. And then as we conclude this lecture, we'll understand how it relates to the decision-making process. Often we think communication is simply about the words we use or the vocal cues like pitch and tone. And these are important, of course. But as you can see there, vocal cues and verbal, the words you actually use, the verbal aspects of communication, only make up about 45% of our communication. What is more relevant are the visual cues, the nonverbal body language and things like that. And certainly if you take the tone and pitch, which is technically not words, it's not the verbal aspect of it, and then you add that to the visual aspects, body language and things like that, really 90+% of what we're communicating is not about the actual words chosen, but it's far more about the interpretation of the pitch, the interpretation of the tone, the body language that we use when we communicate. If we talk with our hands, how close do we speak with someone? Do we stand back? Do we stand close? How are we dressed? How much personal space do we give? So all of these things really do influence the perceptual process. And then, of course, where our challenge lies, as I said already, is that how do I interpret your tone? How do I interpret the visual cues? How do these things impact how I decode the message? And what noise do these things play in influencing the communication process? While the purpose of this class is not to have you practicing communication skills, that's something that will be addressed in electives that you'll see throughout the course, a seminar in human resource management, negotiation class, also Management 523. But it is important for you to recognize the nonverbal skills, because nonverbal communication also can impact your followers and how you communicate decisions, or even how you work with others to make group decisions. So recognizing nonverbal communication is important. So what types of nonverbal communication are there? Well, we've already talked about things like tone, which is a verbal communication, but tone is something that we have to interpret. But dress, how we dress, what does that communicate to people? When we dress professionally, it communicates one message. When we dress more casually, it communicates a very different message. Something like touch. In some cultures, people are comfortable with touch, hugs, kisses, holding hands, where in other cultures, there's a very big distance between people, and touching is not considered appropriate. And certainly in this day and age, when touch can be misinterpreted as sexual harassment, we have to be incredibly careful about the use of touch in a business context. Certainly in a non-business context, what we do with our loved ones, touch, of course, communicates all sorts of things. And that's, of course, within the realm of appropriate. But in the workplace, we try to steer away from touch and communicating via touch. Our posture, standing tall versus slumping over. If you want to appear confident, you stand tall with your shoulders thrown back. If you are uncomfortable, we tend to slump forward, pull our shoulders close, and sort of try to make ourselves invisible. And so you can start to read people's body language and recognize whether someone's feeling confident and open for communication, or whether someone is shutting down and not open for communication. Proxemics is how close or how comfortable we are within space, with others. Do we have a large area of personal space that we require around us, or is our area of personal space very small? In some cultures that are much more collectivistic and more focused on touch, there is very little personal space, that you are connected to each other, you touch each other, there's no qualms about that. And Latin American countries tend to be very demonstrative openly, with very little personal space offered to others around them. And that can be very offensive to those cultures where a large round of personal space is considered appropriate. Making eye contact. Again, eye contact in some cultures is considered perfectly appropriate. We make eye contact. We want to look eye to eye to someone to communicate what we want to communicate, but in some cultures that can be considered a challenge. And where there is high levels of power distance, where someone has a high deference to authority, making eye contact is a challenge. And when we can see this in the animal world, right? When dogs are being submissive, they don't make eye contact, and they will crouch down and look to the ground, versus when animals are challenging each other, they will make eye contact, and they will obviously try to assert their dominance one way or the other. So eye contact can be interpreted as being overly assertive, but in our country, we certainly recognize that making eye contact when we're trying to communicate something is important. So recognizing the context within which you are expressing your nonverbal communication is going to be particularly important when you're working in a global context. Paralanguage. Paralanguage is language where we're sending clues. Paralanguage is not necessarily expressed direct expression of things, but it's more indirect. For example, in Japan, paralanguage is big because we want to understand high context language. We want to understand specifically what someone is trying to communicate with their paralanguage. And so broadly speaking, it's how we hesitate, or it's the tone, or it's facial expression, and it's very contextual. We have to be able to read deeply the paralanguage that's going on. It's, someone's eyebrows, or tone and pitch and speed at which people are talking. It's the extra clues. It's not just the words and it's not just the body, but it's more the extra stuff that's being communicated. Hand movements, of course, we know how people use their hands. I tend to be a very expressive communicator with my hands, and so of course you should see me sitting here doing this lecture. I'm recording this lecture and my hands are flying all over the place, and none of you can see me do that, but nonetheless it's actually sort of funny as I watch myself do this. So hands movements are important, and we learn, particularly depending on the audience where we're communicating, certain types of hand movements are okay and certain type of hand movements are not. And when you're speaking with an audience and you want to show confidence, we keep our hands down by our side. We don't play with things in our hand. We don't twiddle pens and paper clips and stuff. We keep our hands open and by our side, using our hands to direct us one direction or another to communicate the point we want to make. But if they're always not above our head, they're not being flailed around. We manage them in a really controlled way in order to communicate that we have control and that we are in control and confident in the way that we're expressing things. And then facial expressions, some aspects of facial expressions are part of paralanguage, but again, I draw special attention to facial expression because we can be saying the nicest thing with the nicest tone, but if our facial expression communicates something entirely different, we're going to have problems getting our message across, getting our agenda across, directing people to be able to make appropriate decisions. They're reading every nuanced way that we are communicating, and that can create our challenges in decision making.